And it is with great pleasure that I welcome all of you on behalf of Reverend Keiichi Miyamoto, President of Arigato International, and my colleagues, directors of the different Arigato International offices, Mrs. Rebecca Rios-Cohn, Reverend Fred Nyabera, and Dr. Mustafa Ali, to this seminar on nurturing spirituality in early childhood for the prevention of violence. Allow me to give you a few words about Arigato International and what has brought all the experts and us together today. Arigato is an international organization that brings people of diverse cultural and religious backgrounds together for the well-being of children, fostering multi-stakeholder collaborations to ensure that all children are treated with dignity, that all children's rights are respected, and that all children have the opportunity to freely pursue their full and human potential. This seminar is part of the follow-up of the commitments of the Panama Declaration on Ending Violence Against Children that was developed during the Global Forum of the Global Network of Religions for Children last year in Panama. The Global Network of Religions for Children, or GNRC, was founded by Arigato International, and it is the only grassroots network of faith-based organizations working for the well-being of children worldwide. The declaration affirms that children thrive and grow in trusting relationships with people who love them and care for them. And ideally, and for the most part, this happens within their homes. Sadly, it also cannot be denied that the home is the place where most abuses occur. We have different statistics. The most recent UNICEF report tells us that close to 300 children, 3 in 4, aged 2 to 4 worldwide, experience violent discipline by their caregivers on a regular basis. And 250 million children, around 6 in 10, are punished by physical means. The topic of violence against children is not new. The statistics that we hear are not new either. The numbers that we have keep increasing as violence becomes more visible and more awareness is created. And yet, even if only one child is a victim of violence, wouldn't that be enough for us as individuals and communities to do something about it? We see numbers, but violence is about a name. It has a face. It is about a life we have failed to respect, protect, uphold, and value. It's about our failure, individually and collectively, to respect the sacredness and wholeness of life. It is about our failure to challenge the social and cultural norms that justify and normalize violence against children, and that see children as objects and not individuals in their own right, as objects to shape, mold, and even abuse at our own pleasure. Violence against children doesn't only violate children's physical and emotional well-being, but also their spiritual safety and development, as it breaks their connections with others and their sense of trust and respect for other human beings. Violence against children destroys their very sense of interconnectedness that binds us all together as human beings. During this seminar, we will look at the intersections between early childhood development, violence against children, positive parenting practices, the role of nurturing spirituality in children that can break the cycle of violence in the family, and the critical role that religious communities can play. The discussions and outcomes will serve the deliberations of the next 2 days, when representatives of several civil society organizations, academia, multilateral organizations, and experts will come together for the launch and formation of an international consortium to strengthen families to nurture values and spirituality in early childhood, looking particularly at the role of religious communities. Please allow me to finalize with this poem from Khalil Gibran, from the Prophet. And a woman who held a baby against her bosom said, "Speak to us of children." And he said, "Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot even visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. For life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. Let us come together today to share, reflect, learn from one another, and challenge our own view of children. Let us explore new ways of creating nurturing environments, free from violence, where children can grow and develop in their full potential. I thank you for joining us today and for being part of this effort. Thank you very much. So without further ado, please let me introduce you to our keynote speaker, Dr. Kesavino Aram, Director of Shanti Ashram in India. Dr. Aram has been part of interfaith dialogue efforts for the past 20 years. She has led critical child development initiatives globally and across rural India. Together with Shanti Ashram's partnership platform encompassing 215 partners, she is deeply committed to integrated human development initiatives. She founded the International Center of Child and Public Health in 2016, and through its multiple public health initiatives are currently being implemented for vulnerable children. Deeply committed to the Gandhian spirit, she has received several awards for her work and authored a variety of publications. Dr. Aram is co-moderator and executive committee member of Religions for Peace International, board member of the King Abdullah Interfaith Center for Dialogue in Austria, chairperson of the Interfaith Council on Ethics Education of Arigato International, and member of the Governing Council, National Foundation for Communal Harmony, Union Ministry of Home Affairs, in the Government of India, among many others. It is a pleasure, Vinu, to have you here with us. Thank you.
I stand before you with a spirit of celebrations. 10 years ago in Geneva, we gathered with a blackboard, a whiteboard, and a marker pen to see what we could do together and bring the International Interfaith Ethics Education Program alive. And 10 years later, we are here to celebrate the possibility of a collaboration that can impact childhood. It demonstrates both the need, but also, I think, the great commitment of so many of us in this room to keep the conversation and the work going around our children. Distinguished members of the consortium, friends from around the world with whom I have had the pleasure of working alongside for many, many years, colleagues in the Arigato Council, I think it will be not fair for me to say that I will have something extraordinary to offer you. All of you are experts in your field, and this is the richness we will carry forward in the next 2 days to shape our deliberations. What I will bring to you is, I think, the possibility of drawing resources around us that can shape our conversation. Hence, the theme of my address today will be the future can be reimagined for our children. And that is what I want to bring to you. I go back to an image that has stayed in my mind from the Silver Jubilee celebrations of Shanti Ashram. 2,000 young people and children had gathered. Dr. Ariyaratne Vinya is here with us. Dr. Ariyaratne was our guest of honor. And just as the young people were introducing Dr. Ariyaratne to the audience, the master of ceremony, our youth himself, asked the audience, how many of you have experienced violence personally? Almost every child and young person in that gathering raised their hand. I was surprised and shocked and pained at the same time. But what quickly moved from there was one of the most exceptional intergenerational dialogues I saw. 2 elders in that gathering stepped up, Dr. Ariyaratne and my mother. And they turned the momentum of the conversation to what they could do to alter that experience. They ask them what is peace. They ask them how do you build peace. They ask them what is violence, and they ask them to recognize violence that adults perpetrate every day. But in doing so, they were sowing the seeds of a wonderful conversation. In doing so, they were sharing the energy of their generation, that all problems do not have to be left as problems, that we can change it. And hence I thought that image is what I would carry through my conversation and sharing with you today. I hope in my address I will be able to do three things. First, to find intersections between the discourse on child development, violence, the life cycle approach, and also the great discoveries from the field of neurosciences that is influencing cognitive development. I also want to go in the second part of my address to explore with you some of the deeper thoughts and findings that have emerged out of the problematique framework of finding what problems do to children. The third, of course, I would like to see again and reconstruct with you, where is it that we belong? And why is our work important? Is it meaningful? Is it relevant? And the fourth part of my conversation would be relating to what we want to do here, is to find and draw resources within our own faith communities to influence and strengthen this work. So the first one is something that I have been following very closely in the last 15 months as I shape the work at the International Center for Child and Public Health at Shanti Ashram. You know, it almost makes me wonder how violence and violence affecting children has become a central topic in our work for children. Go back to early 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, violence was not central in our conversations. In fact, they were the times when you said, spare a rod and spoil the child. We almost normalized violence. We kept it silently away, tucked away, so that we did not have to experience discomfort in public places. And today, in the 21st century, we have not only spoken about violence, broken the culture of silence, we understand it so much more. We know the dimensions of violence and what it does to our children. So I would say there is a 21st century preoccupation with understanding and challenging violence and its impact on children today. That is something that I want us to remember and remind ourselves as we work the next 2 days. But while we do so, let us also benefit from the work that has come out from the specialities of health and education, which has looked and deconstructed childhood from us. Remember the early years where we spoke very much about nature, where a child is born, who is this child born to the world of nurture, that what the environment around could do to a child. That it was not a doomsday prediction, but you had the window to impact the child. Now, epigenetics, what you accumulate in one generation can be transferred. But we know even more that that graph that we try to define often as to who is a child, our colleagues in UNICEF, and thanks to the inspiring leadership of people like Jim Grant, we have now a consensus on the 0 to 18 definition. But it goes forward and it goes backward. Today, the life cycle approach is something that the deconstruction of childhood has presented to us. That not just the care of the mother, but the care of the mother and the father as adolescents and as children will in fact inform quality and experience of not only the period before birth, but life after birth for a child. I was in a workshop last week, and we were speaking as healthcare providers about the quality of health of a young boy and a girl who will house the next generation. From the quality of the egg to the quality of the sperm, to the quality of their critical thinking, to the abilities that they house in them. How much has gone in understanding childhood and not just stating it as a summarized phrase. We must take time to learn from our colleagues from other sectors as to what these movements of knowledge and experience are. We know a lot in the early childhood. We have to learn more. But we know adolescence is another area of childhood which we are trying to explore. So violence as a 21st century preoccupation and violence that affects children, childhood as deconstructed from the individual lives and hence the intrinsic worth of every boy and girl. Amartya Sen has a beautiful paper. When you have the time, you must look over it. He uses lenses of inequality And in the whole debate around gender, he says, please invest in your daughters so that your sons may be better. And please invest in your sons so that your daughters and your sons may be better. But it's a beautiful paper, and I hope you will take the time to read. But along with this deconstruction is the whole world of neurosciences. So much conversation in the labs where people are doing research, advanced research in neurosciences, is pushing them to have conversations that they have never had before. What does faith do to a child? What does a community mean in the developing of resilience and a positive outlook? Here again, there is much that we can draw upon. It is not one little piece of knowledge. There are multiple streams of knowledge that are coming in, both from very practical programming, simulation of hormonal surges. I was really, really moved to see how a colleague of mine from the UNICEF office in Southeast Asian office was showing me dopamine surges and oxytocin surges and how they use that to do programming for children. I mean, these are not isolated conversations, but conversations that we can draw upon. He called them the sticky factors. What will hold children together? What will hold adults and children together? And what will hold a community together? And finally, as we look at the preoccupation, the deconstruction of childhood, and how science informs us, is of course the reminder that the burden of disease and the burden of deprivation that Maria Lucia just spoke about is expanding. But always with a little underline that we have also more opportunities, resources, and solutions at our hand. It reminds me of another story that I want to share to you. This was, I think, about 4 months ago, or March. This was March. As part of the International Women's Day celebrations, we started the first series of dialogue with boys. This was in schools around in my city to have groups of boys to discuss a dialogue about what violence against women meant. And one young boy from one of the government schools stood up and said, I have a story to share. And he said, my mother and I and my sister live in the ground floor of a house, and we have neighbors in the first floor. And he said, in the first floor, I see every day that the boy goes to a private school and the girls go to a government school. And he said, unfortunately, 6 months later, there was an illness in that family. And the oldest daughter there had to make a decision as to who would go to school because there was not enough money to pay the tuition fees. And he said, when I was seeing all of this conversation, I was thinking, if only the younger boy went back to the government school, everybody would have the possibility of continuing school. And he reflected on his own family experience about how his mother's first point of negotiation with the family that his sister was getting married into was, will she be able to continue her studies? Young boy of 11 and 12 being a witness of social interactions and being able to form critical thinking and critical responses is something that we also, I think, have an opportunity to build upon in the 21st century. Children as active participants is not just a phrase, it's not just a science that is developed. It is something that we have to seek proactively. And there again, I think the words of Swami Vivekananda, the saint philosopher from India, he speaks of divinity that is within, and that has to be unfolded. That has to be allowed to flower and flower so that the person can make active and constructive contributions to society. How does this fit into our modern day work that we want to teach values? We want to teach them ways in which they can critically think and contribute. The space for reflection within and the space for learning without. Is there work for us that we can draw upon here? Is there work that challenges us to think beyond the ordinary, of finding both this reflective space that faith communities offer us, examples where you are challenged to go in further, but also ways in which the modern world teaches and works together? This is where I come to the second part of my sharing today, and I hope you will think with me and you will take some of the questions with you, not only over the next 2 days, but to go forward. I am always fascinated by what Mahatma Gandhi called the spiritual expanse of a human being. Mahatma Gandhi was cognizant of the fact that he was born and he did grow up in a community where many religions coexisted and people of different faiths lived together. So his choice of words and vocabulary is very deliberate. He said spirituality gave us a chance in India to look at what unites us as people of faith. This spiritual expanse today also has relevance in the lives of our children. The quiet and the calm that we want for ourselves is often the quiet and the calm that sometimes our own children want from us. From every day pushing them to achieve things that their brains cannot comprehend at age 10 and 12, where the prefrontal cortex is still growing and they do not know what it would be 20 years from now. In that time, we adults not taking time to give them the space to grow, to struggle, to understand what the world will have for them, but giving them ideas of what they should be. The second aspect also in this period of rapid growth, and we know in early childhood development, 80% of those faculties are grown, but we also know 20% of those faculties can be still shaped in late childhood, in adolescence. We have two windows. When I was in medical school, it was almost like if you don't do it well in the first 2 years, you lose everything. I think it still holds good. A lot of critical interventions before and after birth. But we also know in the fine-tuning, in the pruning, in the shaping of a personality, we have a second window now in early adolescence and going forward. How do you find the balance between understanding what the child is experiencing internally because of biology and what the child or the community of children are accruing in terms of experience from outside? Maria Santos, in her message that Rebecca kindly forwarded to us for the Day of Prayer and Action, speaks about this all-pervasive violence. She speaks about it not only in terms of numbers, which was very nicely pointed out by Maria Lucia, but she also speaks about it as experience, of being first witness and what it does to a child. And this is where I ask you, how do we disrupt it? Have we looked in the educational model that we want to offer? Have we looked in the collaborative model of action that we're looking at? Have we looked at disruptions more clearly? Disruption is a key word that I want you to take from here. Positive disruptions. What could these positive disruptions be, particularly when you speak of an intangible, like values? What could be this disruption that will allow us to measure? I bring to you two examples, again, for you to digest and to take forward. One is the work of the behavioral economist Sendil Mullainathan from Harvard. He speaks about the liberation of the mind from poverty. Poverty fascinates me. I work with a great number of children living in poverty, so I've been trying to understand what this means. And Sendil Mullainathan speaks of poverty as something that takes away the mind space, the mind width, to look at life in its fullness. He says there is a busyness of the mind that the child has to invest in all the time and doesn't have the quiet and the calm. I'm asking us the question, is there a positive disruption that faith communities can bring as quiet and calm? In his list of 10 things that has come out of the work out of the Harvard Child Institute, they say one tip or one working method is family time. Isn't this common grounds for us? Strengthening families and creating this quiet and the calm. The second piece of work that comes out in this particular relationship between childhood and the different challenges they face is also what Mahatma Gandhi said. And I quote him again, that there cannot be a moment when one person grows spiritually and the community around him or her does not benefit. How do we aggregate the quiet calm that we create for an individual child and communities of children? I do not have an answer, but these are two things that I would like us to see. Positive disruption, both in the way of looking at processes that affect children, but also in creating this quiet time for children who are afflicted by poverty and other forms of deprivation. And on the other hand, in this great grand scheme of spiritual expanse of everybody, including children, how do we count? How do we create a much expanded space in looking at what peace and quiet calm do for our children. Of course, when we do this, we also have to be cognizant that we are not creating a picture of the world, a picture of our own communities, and a quick analysis of our own work as one that is hopeless. Our children have to find that hope in the work that we do and the way we speak. I was just telling Reverend Fred Naibero, driving up to this meeting, constructing hope is something that I've been thinking a lot about. How do we construct hope in a tangible way with our children, in our communities? It's very easy to be an alarmist. We can put up all the charts and all the numbers and say the world is not going in the right direction. We must be honest, but we don't have to create a bleak picture for our children and for ourselves. We have to work long years and many days. If we don't do that, then where is it that we can find an intersection, an interface? Many of you here are very distinguished colleagues. I know you know much more than me on these models. I'm just reminding you about, that socio-ecological model that we all learned about in influencing practice and influencing work for children, where the child can be put in the center, the families, the institutions, the communities around that. It's a beautiful one. My slides will all be there with Eleanor, but do pull out from your minds and from your repository of knowledge and information the socio-ecological model of orbits of influence. And I feel in that space, faith communities and religious institutions and leaders and practitioners have a great role to play. People are moving towards that direction, behavioral economists, healthcare providers, especially when mental health dominates the agenda today. They have been able to go beyond the immediate barriers that prevent them from having conversations with other sectors and look at what can be common ground. So orbits of influence, as much as I speak about disruption, please speak within your own communities and look as to how you fit in that socio-ecological model, how we fit as a consortium in that socio-ecological model. And this is where I think I'm reminded of Albert Einstein's words. I don't know if some of you have heard this before, but I love this. He says, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. Remember those early years when we had to explain why the work within faith communities is so important? The early years when we said values can be got from religious communities, institutions, and resources can be got, it wasn't understood, because it wasn't easy to count them. Today, as we have labored and labored sincerely with making this world a better place for our children, as our friends say, a world that is fit for all children, we have labored not only in advancing work within our fields, but I think we have done something very significant. We have opened our halls to every kind of person who can influence our work for children. This is a gift of the 21st century. This is a gift of collaboration and dialogue that we have given to ourselves, and we must seize as we take it forward. I think in this work and in the time that we have together, let us look at this more intentionally. That how this thinking can be informed by science, thinking can be informed by wonderful work in the grassroots, by thinking can be influenced by some path-breaking work that has come and has been placed as a resource for us, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the understanding of violence, the possibility of collaborations at multiple levels. But what we must never forget, and I think this is where I come to the last part of my presentation, is all of this will require us to work beyond the ordinary. We should be able to equip ourselves with information, with experience, but we must also be able to equip ourselves with hope, with openness, with the ability to explore the unknown a little bit more. And this is where our faith might help us. Imam Rashid Omar is here, and something that I have not forgotten, what I heard about 15 years ago from him, was the way that he visualized society and the various pillars that supported it. I don't know if you remember it, Rashid. And you said that each institution of society has a role to play. And when one pillar weakens, the conversation gets skewed. Today, as we celebrate 10 years of Arigato's International Interfaith Ethics Education Program, I think we are giving us an opportunity to look at all these pillars in its richness and its fullness, but with a central and an abiding goal, that our children have the possibility of living in a peaceful world, not a violence-free world, but a peaceful world where they can thrive, where they can learn, where they can absorb, and they can pass on to the next generation a picture that is befitting of humanity, a picture where coexistence and peace can replace deprivation, inequities, and violence, and where, as Gandhiji said, we can hold the talisman in our hands and say, what we do today here will influence the lives of the most vulnerable amongst us equally as much as it will influence the lives of all our children, men and women. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Vino, for these inspiring words, for reminding us of the power of construction, of creating new frontiers for children, and the impact of this creating new hope that is not only the negative, but also this positive thinking and the potential to renew this hope. So thank you very much, Vino. Now we will move to our main panel. And I think this introduction that Vino just gave us is very good to shape the discussions that we will have today. So we will have a panel now that will look to the intersections between violence against children, between early childhood development, between positive parenting practices, working with the families, and nurturing values and spirituality in children. So I want to call to our panelists to please come to the table. And so I'm calling Mr. Frederick Affolter. I'm going to introduce you later. Mr. Andrew Claypole, Mrs. Caroline Arnold, and Dr. Vinia Ariratne. So, well, let's try to make this panel very interactive. We want time to speak with you and also among you. So how we have structured this panel is with questions and answers. And the panelists will have a few minutes to respond. But I will try also to create some connections here. Feel free to interrupt each other to get into dialogue. And after that, we will have 2 rounds of main questions. And then there will be a break where you can interact and ask your questions and give your comments. And then we go to the second round. And so I'm going to introduce each panelist as they start speaking, one by one. And so please let me introduce first to Mr. Frederick Affolter, education expert for risk-informed programming at UNICEF. He also serves as secretary of the Early Childhood Peace Consortium. Until June 2016, Frederick Affolter served as the manager of UNICEF's Peace Building Education and Advocacy Program, which designed education programs that contribute to the mitigation of drivers of conflict in 14 fragile and post-conflict countries. Earlier, UN assignments include Sudan, South Africa, Angola, and Afghanistan, and of course a range of experience working on education, peace building, and now closely related to early childhood development. Thank you, Fritz, for being here. And so we will start with a question for Fritz, Vino very articulately also spoke about the ecosystem of the child. And we know that the child, is exposed to different layers in their development and is exposed to not only the family, but also community, the religious communities, and others. Can you share with us, Fritz, how does the ecosystem of the child affect the child development, and how is the identity formation of the child influenced during this period?
Thank you. Yeah, for me also the eco model is a fantastic model because it gives us a systemic understanding of child well-being, but also violence. And I think different development practitioners, by the way, how long do I speak? 2-3 minutes?
4 minutes max.
Yeah. Development practitioners, when you talk to the educators or the psychologists, they very much focus on the micro, and then but they don't really think that governments or governance can actually make a change. And then we have the people who studied politics, they only think about high-level macro, but they don't think about, for example, the psychology of peace. And I think in UNICEF we are very interested in understanding and practicing with governments. We want to have, of course, we want to impact child well-being. That's our ultimate goal. But we are realizing that for the sake of sustainability, we need to also help governments to appreciate how social services like early childhood development can be leveraged for the reduction of violence. And that is actually not so easy. We actually think that if we are doing a fantastic peace education program in a school, we may actually not have achieved a lot for peace. And it is quite possible that we are going to Somalia, where 2 clans for the first time after 30 years of war built a school together, and their children go together. And there's not a single word of peace spoken, but just the fact that children play together can be a foundation for peace building. So our challenge is, as practitioners, and I'm thinking that faith-based organizations who care so much for peace, they should also put their weight into this. We want to influence governments to understand how social services can be leveraged for the transformation of relationships. We want to build institutional leadership so that education and these fields are being used for peace and not for conflict. As you know, education has 2 phases, ugly phase of fostering stereotypes and discrimination, and a positive phase which is creating social cohesion. And then we want to empower community leaders, we want to have safe schools, and we want to have the well-being in schools, child-friendly schools. I think we can strengthen the identity of children when they grow up in safety, when they feel effectiveness, when they experience themselves as effective citizens, when they have control over their environment, when they have a sense of positive belonging, but they're also autonomous and independent, and when they have chances to explore. From the beginning, even in early childhood development, how relationships, in what kind of relationships children are being born, and that is how they will relate in the future with the world. But we cannot criticize, or we should not be surprised. It will not happen alone through virtues and through nurturing. We need to empower the caregivers to provide the stimulations. And very often caregivers cannot provide the stimulation and the modeling because they are living in systems of structural violence and discrimination and limitations and stresses which very often prevent them from becoming optimal caretakers. So the eco model urges us to consider all levels and don't just focus only on the micro and the macro. And perhaps that could be a challenge to be further discussed in the next 2 days, and how faith-based organizations do not just provide good, safe schools at the ground, but how they also leverage their power and advocacy to talk with higher levels to create the systems which protect and buffer from stress.
Thank you, Frederick. And this is very important because I think what you mentioned, that sometimes we think that one intervention is enough and it will change. But we know that precisely that ecosystem of the child requires that interventions are holistic, that we look at different ways, and that requires collaboration and different actors coming together. Thank you very much, Fritz. So I want to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Andrew Claypole, Senior Advisor to the Office of the Special Representative to the Secretary General on Violence Against Children, Mrs. Marta Santos Pais. Mr. Claypole has 25 years of experience in social policy, research, monitoring and evaluation, and communication in the UN and UNICEF. Most recently, he was Chief of Social Policy at UNICEF Thailand and Chief of Program Planning and Monitoring and Evaluation in UNICEF China. In these capacities, he provided technical support in social policy analysis, research, and monitoring and evaluation to a range of government partners, academic institutes, and NGOs, and supported the government on the first national survey on violence against children. 2015, he coordinated the advocacy of the Office of the SRSG on the development of indicators to monitor the violence against children targets of the Global Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you, Andrew, for being here with us. So the question for you, Andrew, and I think now we are linking more to the aspect of violence. We were speaking more on what early childhood means and all this ecosystem. But we know that early experience of violence has lasting effects and implications for children's development and well-being. What does evidence show in terms of the impact of violence in early years and what are its costs for society?
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. I wanted to start because I'm not sure that everybody knows what the SRSG on violence against children is. Marta Santos Pais is the SRSG on violence against children. The mandate was established by the General Assembly in 2006 to be a global advocate for the ending of violence against children and to build bridges to connect different communities of stakeholders who work on violence against children. And it was established as a result of the UN study on violence against children, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And even in 2006, the UN study on violence against children was already identifying the need for interventions in early childhood to bring an end to violence against children. And that was before, of course, we have all of the science which has been done over the last 10 years or so, showing what the very severe impact of violence against children is. And the study made recommendations on strengthening social protection for children, positive parenting programs, and so on. So we're talking about something, it was known, of course, before 2006, but I think the UN study was the first time it had really all been brought together in such a comprehensive way. So we've known for a long time that we need to intervene and to make effective interventions in early childhood if we're going to bring an end to violence against children. And there are 4 points I'd like to make about why we have to do that. I think the first is that it's a global phenomenon. Dr. Quezevino gave some of the science this morning. Maria Lucia mentioned the scale of it. Just to repeat, the UN study, the UNICEF study, Familiar Face, which was launched 2 years ago, said that close to 300 million children aged between 2 and 4 experience psychological aggression and or physical punishment by their caregivers at home. And 176 million children under 5 years of age witness domestic violence. We know that this kind of environment that young children are brought up in creates a whole set of, through the toxic stress, the mechanisms which Dr. Quezevino mentioned this morning, have a very immediate impact. It's very painful for children, it's very disturbing for children, but it has medium and long-term consequences. I don't think, I won't go into that now, I think we'll discuss it during the day, but the long-term impacts are huge. They result in a lot of competency deficits in adulthood, and perhaps the most pernicious aspect of this, it becomes a cycle that children who've been exposed to violence in early childhood are more likely to become perpetrators of violence against children in adulthood, and indeed as victims. They're more likely to become victims of gender-based violence, for example. So this kind of vicious cycle that exists needs to be broken. And the investments that we make in early childhood can help make that break. The second point I think I wanted to make was that we also have an international legal obligation. With the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the optional protocols, we have a framework of states' obligations to intervene in early childhood and ensure that children live free from violence. So in the advocacy that the SRSG makes, she always begins by saying this is an ethical imperative, it's a human rights imperative. But in addition, we also have other strong arguments, and not the least of which is the economic cost of violence. I'm actually an economist by training. I'm not a human rights specialist or a child protection specialist. So I've been particularly interested over the last few years in working with the SRSG to look into this issue. And there have been a number of studies done over the years that have tried to make the estimates of the cost of violence against children. But perhaps the one that's quoted most was a study done 3 years ago by the Overseas Development Institute. And they estimated that the annual cost of violence against children around the world was $7 trillion US. What's surprising about that figure is not only that it's extremely large, but that it doesn't take into account the loss in human capital. It looks really at the direct costs of addressing violence against children, the cost for hospitalization, the cost of interventions, the cost of, more or less the cost of responding to the immediate effects of violence against children. But if, as we know now from the science, that the impact in early childhood has these long-term impacts, which ultimately can affect the way individuals can participate in society as citizens of society, but also as productive members of society, it's absolutely huge. So I think this is another very important aspect of why we need to intervene. I think the final thing I would say is that, in terms of the imperatives to act, is that I think we really now know how to prevent violence against children. There are many proven interventions now which have been shown to be very effective in intervening in early childhood to prevent violence against children, particularly positive parenting models and so on. So we have a very comprehensive case, I think, for addressing early childhood interventions to prevent violence. I think I will mention some of them in more detail in the next round, but I'll stop there, if that's okay.
Yeah. That's very good. Thank you, Andrew, because I think this gives us a picture. I think the two panelists have given us a broad picture, and I want now the other two panelists to kind of focus more on the relations with the caregivers and what we call this nurture spirituality and values that we have been discussing here. So let me introduce you to our next panelist. It's Mrs. Caroline Arnold, educationist and early childhood specialist. Caroline Arnold has 35 years of experience globally. She spent over 12 years as Director of Education at the Aga Khan Foundation, overseeing the education and early childhood portfolio across 17 countries in South and Central Asia, Eastern and West Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Prior to this, she spent many years living and working in South Asia and East Africa. She has been a staff member of UNICEF, international NGOs such as Save the Children and Action Aid, and universities in London and the Pacific. She's a frequent contributor to multiple policy fora, national and international, and is the author of numerous publications in the area of early childhood development, transitions, children's learning, and the meaning of learning, inclusion and exclusion, community-based rehabilitation, and state, non-state partnerships. Thank you, Caroline, for being here with us. So, Caroline, I think now your role is kind of focusing us a little bit more. We have this big picture, and we know the implications of violence in early childhood, how it affects the development of the child. We know that the home environment is paramount to the children's full development and the quality of the relations between caregivers and children. So why is it so important for us to give attention to nurturing values and spirituality in early years, Caroline?
Thank you, Maria Lucia. And before I start, I just want to say what a pleasure and a privilege it is to be here and to have the opportunity to learn from such an amazing group. It's wonderful for me. This, of course, is one of the big questions for us. And the answer, in fact, is very simple in some ways. We need to be giving attention to nurturing values and spirituality when children are young, because that's absolutely fundamental, that nurturing, to our very humanity. We live in such extraordinarily materialistic times where we're constantly being persuaded that we can buy happiness. And spirituality, of course, is the very opposite of this. Its concern is with the inner self, with reflection, with compassion for others, with wonder, with reverence for life, and those deepest values and meanings by which we live. And I thought Dr. Kezavino Aram summarized it beautifully when she talked about the mind space and that quiet calm that parents can offer children. And in these current, very fragile and often already fractured times, we need to be asking ourselves, are children being equipped not only with the knowledge and skills, but also with the attitudes and values that are going to enable them to interact with their world and also really contribute to it? Because it's those core human values which are critical to the quality of all our relationships with ourselves, with others, with the world. And it's relationships, of course, which are actually central to everything. And I think the older you get, the more you really realize this. You know, whether we're talking about families, whether we're talking about a health center, an early childhood center, a community, a country, and international relations, indeed, at the end of the day, it's all about relationships and whether they're working or not. And of course, it's those relationships during the earliest years which lay down those pathways influencing the entire life, which again, our keynote, I mean, was so wonderful in the way that you talked about that. Central to everything. You know, it's the physical, it's the cognitive and academic, it's the social and emotional, it's the moral and spiritual. And the way that families and other caregivers nurture their children or are unable to do so has got, again, as you said, not only lifelong but intergenerational implications for our well-being, our productivity, and for social cohesion. And we always hope for nurturing care, that wonderful synergy of protection and safety, of good health and nutrition, of a stimulating environment and opportunities to learn, and affectionate and responsive interaction and communication that's going to really develop those core human values and personal qualities. I'm talking about things like kindness, empathy, open-mindedness, generosity, appreciation, courage, perseverance, honesty, integrity, and that sense of fairness and that cooperation and sense of belonging. All qualities which are, of course, essential to all human faiths and indeed to humanism. And I think it's also important to remember that studies by people like the Nobel laureate Heckman and the psychologist Duckworth absolutely confirm that it's these broad set of personal qualities, much more than test scores, that actually powerfully predict well-being across all spheres of life. But trends in early childhood programming internationally are actually not in this direction at the moment. The rhetoric sounds great. It's all holistic and concerned with overall development. All sounds lovely. But in practice, when I spend time in country after country, low, middle, high income, there's more and more pressure on early childhood programs to be producing good academic test scores. I mean, it's just extraordinary. You know, many of us were involved in pushing for the Sustainable Development Goal 4.2, and we want it. You know, all children should have access to early childhood programs and supports so that they're ready for primary education, as it states. But that phrase, ready for primary education, has actually been a very double-edged sword, because time and again you see wonderful, vibrant, joyful, rich learning environments being transformed into places where children are sitting at a desk, they're copying from a board, very likely in English. It's a real challenge for us in the early childhood world at the moment, because it's not just centre-based programs that are facing this. Parenting programs often have a heavy influence towards the cognitive. And people worry about, oh, does my child know their colours yet? Oh dear, can she count to 10? Well, all kids develop all these things. And surely we need really to be more concerned with what sort of people our young children are becoming, what sort of values they are developing. And that's where I believe this consortium has a really important contribution to make.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for reminding us that even if we speak of the importance of nurture spirituality, it's still very much behind in ECD programming, and the work of, in many countries, governments, it's still something that doesn't appear in the agenda very often. So let me introduce you to our last panelist, Dr. Vinya Ariyaratne, Secretary General of the Sarvodaya Movement in Sri Lanka. Dr. Ariyaratne is a board-certified specialist in community medicine and a past president of the College of Community Physicians of Sri Lanka. He obtained his Doctor of Medicine degree from De La Salle University in the Philippines and his Master of Public Health degree from Johns Hopkins University in the United States. He also holds the degrees of Master of Science and Doctor of Medicine in Community Medicine from the Postgraduate Institute of Medicine of the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka. Dr. Ariyaratne has worked with children affected by war and developed many programs to address children issues in Sri Lanka, including child trauma, reintegration of child combatants, malnourished of children, among many others. Thank you, Vinya, for being here with us. So, building on all this, Vinya and now Caroline talked about spirituality, and we know that it's developed in this ecosystem of the child at different levels. And we also know that understanding and supporting children's spirituality is not always easy for caregivers, particularly in changing environments affected by violence, poverty, or conflict. Based on your experience working with families in Sri Lanka, and perhaps from a Buddhist perspective as well, how can families create enabling environments to nurture values and spirituality in a changing and challenging environment as the ones you have experienced, and what factors should be considered?
Thank you, Maria Lucia. Good morning to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be here speaking in this panel on a very important problem that we all try to address in our part of the world. Sarvodaya movement, which I represent, has actually pioneered a lot of children's programs in Sri Lanka, including the early child development programs in the rural parts of Sri Lanka in the 1970s. Just 2 weeks back, I had an interactive session with a group of preschool teachers, ECD center teachers, who are part of our network, particularly to discuss about the rising trends of violence against children in Sri Lanka. And we tried to get their views on how they discipline children in their own preschool. It was very interesting, the findings. Actually, we had a focus group discussion, and they were coming up with even some justification for physical punishment of children. Now, we are living in 21st century, and we have quite a bit of knowledge on how using physical punishment affect negatively the growth of children. So now what is clear is that some of these scientific knowledge that we talk about, the stimulation and the positive parenting, all that has not penetrated to the ground, including the caregivers. So how do you change that situation? So to answer the question on how do we really develop spirituality and enhance it in a family setting, I think that's an important word that you used, Maria Lucia, the innate ability for spirituality. Every child has a potential, which is potential for many things, but also we are spiritual beings. Almost all children are born in a setting where there are some tradition of faith and also cultural practices related to upbringing children in that safe environment. However, we know that the environment has changed so much around the world. Today, they are not growing up in a safe and a healthy environment. So in Buddhism, we believe that there is interconnectedness of everything, interconnectedness of human beings to nature and to inanimate things. So we grow up ideally in a situation where children are really taught on this interconnectedness, so that we have to respect each other. But the reality is that I think, as it was mentioned earlier, I think Andrew touched on it, the economic dimension. Today, the backbone of the Sri Lankan economy is by women. Our biggest income is by women who go to Middle East and send remittances to the country. That's the top national income. They leave behind children who are not being looked after properly in their family settings. The caregiver is sometimes a stepmother or a grandmother or a relation, and you don't get that protection. So we need to look at child well-being in a very holistic manner. So that's very, everybody talks about holistic manner, but how can we work at different levels, not just at the grassroots level, but also at the policy level? And in no other time in the history where there is a requirement now to work at both levels in a very well coordinated manner. So we try to adopt an integrated approach to early child development in Sri Lanka, where we bring in the spiritual element, which is translated in bringing in practices like meditation, mindfulness into daily work of daily learning processes of a preschool, and we have established more than 8,000 preschools around the country. And we also try to link it to a larger process of sustainable development in the community. So you don't see this as a isolated, the spirituality-based approach to child well-being as an isolated thing, but it's a much more integrated thing of development. Now, for example, our preschools function totally by volunteer teachers, but at some point they become full-time paid teachers run by a community organization. So the community organization needs to generate an income so that it can support the preschool teacher, not just the voluntary contributions coming from the parents to run the preschool. So you try to extend this model into a more sustainable development program in the village, where you connect it to microfinance, employment generation, and creating economic opportunities for women, mothers who are not then, who don't have to then go out of the country or out of their village to seek employment. So we teach a large number of preschool teachers using this holistic approach, and also we try to promote home-based early childhood development practices, 0 to 3 years. So it's not just the preschool, but before they come to the preschool. Then also we have a program where particularly the Buddhist meditation practice is being integrated into programs for pregnant mothers. We work very closely with the government maternal and child health program. So the mothers, along with their husbands or mothers-to-be, come together and they join in spiritual practices. So they bring in that element. They become sensitive that if within our family violence happens, that affect the unborn child, that child can then become a violent person. So using the religious teachings in a very meaningful way, we try to influence that. Then finally, one of the most important elements is creating an institutional mechanism so that these preschools are not run in isolation. The preschool teachers are not not functioning in isolation. They may integrate home gardening. Now, we had a flood just last year which destroyed many preschools, but we turned it to an opportunity for the children to learn about nature, about climate change. You know, their home garden where they came in the morning and worked for about a half an hour, now suddenly get flooded and even their books got destroyed. So how do you then teach children that there are certain elements that we ourselves don't respect nature? We do things that harm the nature, so therefore the drainage lines are blocked, and that's how we face. So I think the spiritual elements has to be brought out of temples, churches and covils into daily lives of people, and how you can connect with the scientific knowledge using modern technology as well. So when the child is growing up, we have to create more innovative programs that we can connect the child's growth to each context that they are going to face from adolescence and late childhood. So finally, in conclusion, what I believe is collective action based on the most modern knowledge, but also based on religious teachings, which we all know, those of us who really practice those basic elements which are very scientific, if you may call them, and we have a real need now to address them through collective action, where communities come together, not in isolation, but through various programs which complement each other, so that from individual level to the family and to the country, we can have a coordinated effort supported by international efforts, consortia like this, and also the Secretary General's initiative, so that all these things are interconnected. So I think we have a very challenging task, but at the same time, I think we have an excellent platform and opportunity today to work together, combining spirituality towards child well-being. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinia, for this great example. I think we talk a lot on how this is integrated, and I think the case of Sarvodhe movement is a great example of how it's put there at all levels in the community for development. I like what you said, Vinia, on taking spirituality, move it from the temples, from the sacred places. And I think this is very important, because spirituality doesn't only belong to the religious sphere, it belongs to everyone. And I think that's also part of the work, is reaching out to those who do not belong to any particular religion. But here we also acknowledge, of course, the important role of religious communities in creating those sacred spaces and that spirituality, and bringing out outside of their places. So thank you for reminding us of that. So I would like to open it for questions from the audience, or even from yourselves, and so that we can initiate some dialogue. So please raise your hand, introduce yourself, name and organization you represent. Any other question? Vino?
I enjoyed the interventions very much. Caroline, a question to you. You know, this Ready for Primary Education has been sort of the abiding slogan, right, in all our countries to get kids into school. How can that slogan be expanded from your experience to also say ready for life?
Yeah, very much. Okay. I mean, I remember with the consultative group on early childhood care and development, we really pushed for children ready for schools, schools ready for children. And of course, that's what we really want to see. But I also agree totally that it has to be ready for life. And that's what's worrying with what's happening at the moment, that we have been very excited about pushing up the great practices from early childhood into lower primary, where they're equally needed. After all, early childhood programs are about prenatal to 8, so it's taking in early primary. And we've done a lot of work in that area, but now I think it's because of this pressure that governments are feeling like, oh gosh, there's this 4.2 target, we've got to do something. And that's where it's gone wrong, because it's like the easiest thing to do is to just roll out what you do in grade 1. So it's challenging, but we have to take it on. It's so important. Can I just very quickly respond a little bit to your very important question too, which kind of actually is part of what is going to come up in the next round. But I could not agree more. I think there's so much in the discussion about preventing and addressing violence. There's so much emphasis on changing the violent behavior of adults and indeed other children who are in immediate contact with the young child. You know, we talk about through laws and implementing them, through norms change, through parenting programs. I mean, there's the whole Inspire framework. But I think that it's more than a risk. I think we don't pay enough attention to addressing those systemic issues that you spoke to, Fred. It really, you know, whether we're talking about conflict, as in what you're talking about, particularly there, whether we're talking about really sort of just systemic social justice issues in general that exclude or marginalize some children and their families, and absolutely routinely. I mean, it makes people's lives impossible and results in such incredible stresses that violence becomes increasingly likely within the home, because that's the experience at multiple levels of society. I mean, just think of, you know, if you've even not in a conflict situation, if you've been working really flat out for a 12-hour day, you've been abused by your boss during that day, you've then waited for ages for any sort of transport to get home, you spent the whole day really worrying about, can I pay the rent? Can I put food on the table? How am I going to find the money to take my child to the health centre, which is supposed to be free but actually isn't? If that's what you're walking through your door with in your head, that crying child desperately needing your attention can so easily be the trigger for a slap rather than a hug. So I really think we need to give very major attention to that. Thank you for that important question.
We know each other. I think really that's where we are hitting a little bit a huge dilemma, and maybe we should have no panelists should be expected to answer your question. But it is such a bothersome question, because there comes a point, especially when we want to leverage social services for peace building. There are situations where all I can do is to act conflict sensitive. Conflict sensitive means do no harm. But what I actually want to do is to do more good. But when I'm going, for example, into an area like Palestine, and where young children and youth are absorbing the stresses of the entire impasse there, even if you want to help and you want to provide support and psychosocial support and resilience, you very easily will be criticized. Why do you want these children to be resilient? You basically want to maintain the status quo. But the situation then comes really to a point where the political impasse is so that we then I don't know to what an extent we then actually can still make a change. Then of course you create movements, you try to do political advocacy, but the political advocates also don't resolve the impasse. I'm thinking that my hope is that, you know, we can do brain scans where we can see how far a brain is developed. I actually would like to do a soul scan of societies, where we can see to what an extent society or social systems are socio-emotionally empowered to be creative and also to cope. And perhaps then if we could show the politicians that those are the consequences and attach it to some financial numbers, you know, those are the costs, maybe we would get to that point. So very, very difficult question, because there comes actually, and that's what we have to discuss the next 2 or 3 days. We talk about psychosocial and spiritual, and yes, we believe in those things and there are mental benefits, but we are coming at a political impasse where we don't know how to continue. The issue with school readiness and primary education is really a big dilemma. So many parents, especially in refugee communities, like for example in Ethiopia, children have to go to pre-primary learning spaces to learn, not to play. Because we want them to, the sooner they learn, the sooner they will be smart and they will have a chance to break out of poverty. And as a result, they're not allowed to learn, to play. And that prevents them from learning many, many important things. So playing, participation, those are things where our norms prevent us from actually allowing children to grow up naturally. And I think there should also be advocacy, because I actually would almost say that play and fun is a spiritual thing, isn't it? You experiment, you explore, that's where you become the scientist, that's where you become curious, and we don't allow those things to evolve. Yeah, so I hope that we can use science and religion together, because very often science and religion speak to one another. What the brain sciences tell us allows us now. We now have the biology of peace, of justice. Those are values religious and spiritual teachings hold up high. But we, until very recently, could not really prove it quantitatively. You know, not everything which counts can be counted. As a matter of fact, we are getting more to the point where we can count what counts. That's really exciting about our time. Perhaps there we could put more emphasis into it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Just to also respond to the structural violence part of it. I mean, this is the biggest dilemma. Now we have certain leaders who use religion itself to further, you know, create hatred. And we have had a war for 30 years in our country, and we really don't want to have another war in our country. Still, we haven't created the conditions for young people to be able to, you know, develop their lives in a more constructive way rather than taking into arms again. But there are also political interests in creating more tension so that, you know, they can come to power. So this is the dilemma. So how can we change the exploitative economic and political systems which perpetuate violence, create conditions for violence? That's why we are facing also a dilemma. People are questioning us. We are trying to address the consequences. We are really not addressing the root cause. Of course, root cause is not just economic and political. There are also cultural and social elements as well. So, but now we have had like 20, 30 years of work addressing those social and to some extent economic conditions, but the structural violence, addressing those, preventing armed conflicts in the future is a major challenge. We have to find new ways. Some of our colleagues even want to now set up political, you know, organizations, because they don't believe anymore that civil society action itself will make a difference.
Sorry, thank you. Caroline, I think you have responded a bit to this. This was part of the next question, what happens in those contexts of structural violence, and how can interventions be developed to help addressing those? But there is also a second part of that question, is what role do religious communities play in this? So Caroline, if you want to maybe deep a little bit more into that question and respond to the second one.
Thank you. I'll just touch on the first one as well, because I do think it's really important for us to remember that early childhood programs are about a range of supports for families, for communities, institutions that really strengthen their ability to care for and nurture children, support their overall development. And so really by definition, if we're serious about that, then it's a very wide range of initiatives that fall under that sort of early childhood umbrella, if you like, from working with families to changing systems which marginalise, neglect or exclude. It's really about influencing the contexts in which young children are growing so that they're supportive of the child's overall development. And I think Fred really took us through those contexts and that sort of those concentric circles. And I think the nurturing care framework pulls that together very nicely when it talks about caregiver capabilities just around the child, empowered communities, supportive services, and enabling policies that actually get implemented. That's my add-on, but that's critical, absolutely critical. And of course, it's those wider socio-cultural, economic, and political contexts that have such a very powerful influence and really dictate a huge amount of the child's everyday experience. And I want to just touch on the fact that also, if we're thinking about that, we need to build it into parenting programs too. You know, we're quite used to thinking of parenting programs as about basically enhancing parents' abilities to support their children's development. And of course, that's a huge part of it. But we also need to be helping parents hold other duty bearers accountable. And they can only do that when they have information and then when they have the confidence to use that information and are able to use it. So more and more, I think we're starting to see programs trying to make sure that, for example, parents know if there's either supposed to be a health worker attached to a post or there's provision in the budget for early child development workers in a centre. If parents know that, it's much easier for them to go and knock on the door and say, excuse me, why have these centres not been open for 6 months? So very, very practical, and it's about them really being able to have agency to act on their own behalf and on behalf of their children. And the role of religious communities, well, I feel that just about everybody in the room is infinitely more qualified to really give wonderful responses to this. So I hope we'll have time for that. But of course, religious communities have a vital role to play. The shared values, the ethical framework, that reflective space that you spoke of, which, you know, is something that really faith communities offer so importantly. And if a respected religious leader really takes a stand and actively addresses issues of violence against young children, that's so important. And of course, it's especially important for violence against young children to be addressed, because the younger the child, the less the voice. I think it's also, again, important when we're talking about system evidence, system influence, rather, that religious leaders really use their moral authority to hold governments to account. And you see that happening in many places, but perhaps it's something that we need to make sure is really part of the conversations we have over the next few days, because there is that tremendous moral authority which can really be called on to really push governments to address those system issues. And of course, we also know that unfortunately, you know, religions are sometimes misused to really try and justify violence, and powerful religious figures can really misuse their power, as we've seen far too often in the media over recent years especially. And obviously this is critical to be addressed. But overall, the potential power of religious communities to be a force for good in countering violence against children is clearly enormous. It's a huge opportunity for us.
Thank you, Caroline. And I think this will be over the course of these days. For those who are here, as I mentioned in my introduction, we are forming this consortium on this topic, and then there will be 2 days more of discussions on the topic. And I hope that you will continue being part of this conversation, those who are not part of the consortium in one way or another. And we will be looking at this role of religious communities. I'm glad to see Pastor Andy. He's the pastor of the congregation I go, the Lutheran Church of Geneva. And then we have also the Zen master, also from one of the Buddhist centers here in Geneva. And so I'm happy to see some religious leaders also, taking an interest in the topic and seeing what else we can do, capitalizing on this, as you said, this moral power and capital that is invested in you. So I want to move to Fritz. So we know, and there is evidence, as Andrew was saying, we already know what, how to, in a way, affect violence, what works to prevent violence in a way. And we know that there are interventions that look at the whole child and that are effective and support families and support the prevention of violence. What is the relation, or what are the links between those interventions and peace building? And looking at your experiences leading the education and peace building program at UNICEF for many years, how do you see the relation between those interventions and peace building? We have talked about the structural issues, but let's look at it also at the positive level.
When you talk to a peace builder in the UN, how do you do peace building? They said you should analyze the root causes of conflict. And the root cause is, hey, you tell me what the root causes are. Maybe it was Adam and Eve. And how can we mitigate that? But it helps us. There's something good about this question, because it forces us to break a little bit out of our favorite little bubble of expertise. We have to go and say, what are the root causes? And then you tell me how an educator, for example, can contribute to the mitigation of the root cause. But when I go, for example, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we were both working, the root cause there are land issues. So maybe I cannot do that much as an educator. But then still, if I was a representative of UNICEF and very interested in education, I should still use my influence to tell my other co-leaders in the country, let's do something about land issues, because it creates so much violence. Because it is the violence from which children suffer, and it is from non-violence from which children benefit. Governments can distribute social services, and that includes early childhood for peace building, in such a way that people come together. And if we have policies which recognize the right for early childhood development, not just primary and up, and there's money going into it, and that it's not just for developmental purposes, but also for the transformation of relationship, then we have the leadership. And then if we build capacity of and services for early childhood development, then we are benefiting not only children, but also parents. I would like to give an example. Where that actually worked really, really well. And it is, again, an example where we did not contribute to peace and nonviolence by simply talking and providing peace and nonviolence in a kindergarten setting. It went much, much further. In Côte d'Ivoire, there was a problem of electoral violence in the far-out communities. So the ethnic communities would not talk to one another. A woman could not go to the neighbor and borrow flour because she didn't have flour that day, or leave the child alone in the house, because everyone belonged to a political party. Every political party belonged to an ethnic group. Every ethnic group was represented by a military group. And the military groups came in through different days of the year, and they knew exactly which house to loot and which house not to loot. And the people from the looted houses, they knew exactly whose house was not looted and why it was not looted. And you could be sure that those people whose house was not looted would eventually be looted by somebody else. And it affected everyone. It affected the whole ecosystem, and affected children. And so what UNICEF did there with Caritas, a faith-based organization, we said we are going to provide in these areas kindergartens, but only under the condition that children from all ethnic communities are allowed to attend this kindergarten. And at the beginning, there was resistance from the chiefs, which were the chiefs of the majority. and why should they like it that enemy children also go? But it was eventually accepted because the traction, this opportunity of early childhood development in the community and paid, that was too attractive to say no. So then mothers, obviously not the fathers, bring their children to schools and they start talking. It really worked. And then those mothers who were relieved from babysitting jobs actually went together and they did literacy classes together. And as you know from Freire, in literacy class you don't just learn to read and write, you also talk about a few other things which matter to the community. Eventually you learn how to read and write. You can check the text messages of your husbands, and you know that husbands have similar problems. And not only that, after mothers kind of began to connect, and they realized we can connect despite our ethnic differences. And sometimes even mothers engaged in cross-ethnic business interventions. So a tie of friendship was forged. And for them, I think the psychosocial relief of being able to talk to one another and not being isolated, that was probably the biggest thing. It was even bigger than learning to read and write. But they then talked with the husbands. And then the husbands kind of agreed. They let the women bring their children to those schools, and they let go to those inter-ethnic literacy classes. So then the mothers joined mother clubs, and they engaged in activities. So you see there's a spiral. We are not yet fully up in the ecosystem, but we started from a kindergarten and literacy classes, children doing well, mothers doing well, stress release, to going a little bit up into the community, doing mother clubs, engaging in business, husbands joining. And then the next stop was that we actually wanted to go to governments, and the government wanted to participate, but then there's no money, funds stop, and then everything breaks down again. But lesson learned is we were able to leverage early childhood development services in partnership with a faith-based organization with approval of the government, and we did it in 17 villages, and more villages came and asked. Guess what happened after 2 or 3 years politically in those villages? The next elections came around. Politicians came, the ones from the party who were connected with militia, who courted the mothers, the heads of the women of the mother clubs. Would you like to join our party? And the mother said no, despite financial disadvantage. Now that's resilience, that's psychosocial resilience, because they realized that they didn't want to join a politicization issue which led to the breakup of society at the beginning. How they are doing today, I don't know. Would have elections been violent if we had not conducted this intervention, and would have children suffered? Perhaps no, perhaps things were okay and the elections would have been non-violent also without our intervention. But we can definitely demonstrate that leveraging those social services helps people connect around their children, because young children, that's what unites us. And it can help people to overcome conflict, to begin to discuss reconciliation, despite many atrocities which have happened in the past. So it's a case study which we can keep into consideration.
Thank you, Fritz, for this experience, and that reminds me what you said, you know, the formation of these relations, of the restoring relationships in the community, and that relates to what you were saying also from early years, learning to relate to one another. And I feel like we have to do this when, you know, all the conflicts arise and we go back to the same. Children were to learn from the very beginning these powerful, the powerful ways of really interconnecting one another and respecting those web of relationships. Maybe we would avoid those in the future. So, Vinny, I'm moving to you. The question is more about working with religious communities. And we know, and Caroline mentioned that religious communities can play a very important role in challenging social and cultural norms that justify violence against children, as well as supporting families in nurturing values and spirituality. But how can civil society organizations, many that are present here, can work more closely with religious communities? And what do you think are effective ways to challenge those rooted behaviors and attitudes that challenge violence against children, that justify violence against children?
Thank you. Fortunately, most of the religious teachings are actually promoting child well-being and positive human relationships. I think what had happened is that a lot of religions have or for other reasons, other political objectives, they have misinterpreted the teaching. So what we first do is try to generate intra-faith dialogue on some of these great important issues that are faced by the children, and try to look at the religious literature, the teachings, in a very neutral manner. We sometimes get the children themselves involved, from what they learn in school through their religion. What are the things that you feel are relevant to the kinds of feelings, challenges, problems that you see? So start with the basic teachings of religion to promote intra-religious dialogue, and try to identify explanations, some of the wisdom, and also some of the key positive messages which could be then used in different settings. Now, in the Buddhist context, we have what you call Jataka stories. Those are stories of the Buddha whose previous births. His stories about 500 lives he had before. And most of these stories give a very positive social message. And we selected some of the things which are related to child rights in the modern day context, and then try to relate how this story signifies a certain value that we need to promote in our own family, within our own village, and the community and country as a whole. So we can use some of these teachings that are there in those religious literature, and also use in a very creative way, use cartoons, social media. We are doing all that. So civil society organizations can be an interface between the religious organizations and your activism, to bridge some of the positive teachings in those religions in a very innovative and a creative way, to give a positive message. And also we try to link some of these action to larger contextual issues. For example, we already discussed about structural issues. Now there are certain legislations which need to be changed. So some may relate to religious laws. For example, the age at marriage for girls may differ in certain societies for certain religious groups. It's a very sensitive subject. So how do you then address this in through a very healthy discussion involving those religious communities as well as the other communities who are also very sensitive about these issues? So addressing deeply rooted religious beliefs which are harmful for children, and also which will not really promote harmony, religious harmony, I think can be addressed if we can really find innovative ways. So knowledge generation, and also certain tools, and we are doing that, and we have a knowledge center also, which is a regional knowledge center under child poverty program, where we try to collect these small stories which give a strong message, and also some of the researchers. So sharing of experience between certain religious communities is also important, because it's not only for that particular religion, but also for other religions also you can draw messages. So we have for example created a cartoon book, story book called Stories of Peace, deriving the key very popular stories from each religion. We translated into Sinhala and Tamil, and that's a very popular publication, and we get the children to read, and then other children listen in a multicultural environment. So I think in conclusion, we can develop a culture of zero tolerance to violence, not by just having slogans, we reject violence, but by promoting respect for all living and non-living beings, and also connecting that to our daily spiritual lives.
Thank you, Vinia, for these very concrete examples. This is excellent. And moving to Andrew. Andrew, I mean, we have been talking about all this, and I want to go back to the violence piece, because I would like to know what promising policy and programmatic interventions for early childhood development can be highlighted, but also what gaps do we still need to fill to prevent violence in early childhood. And we have heard a few examples and ideas, but maybe focusing more on early childhood, if you can share some promising examples that can, give some light here of what are we talking about.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted actually to I don't think we have time to go into too many of the details, but I actually wanted to recommend something which Caroline has already mentioned, which is the Inspire package. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. This is a new, well, relatively new initiative which was launched by a consortium of international agencies led by the WHO and UNICEF and some others, which really tries for the first time to pull together all of the evidence-based interventions which are shown to be effective in addressing violence against children. It's very much a work in progress. It's been issued now, but it's going to be continuously updated as new knowledge and evidence becomes available. And I think that there are many good things about the Inspire package, but I think one of them is to address the point that Vignat made, which is that I think that the knowledge and information hasn't really filtered down to the grassroots. And there can be many reasons for this, but I think that one of them has been the lack of such a package with that degree of credibility. Again, as Caroline said, there are many experts in the room, and I'm not one to question them, but I don't think there's a huge amount that is new in the Inspire package. Many of the approaches were already known, and as I mentioned before, even in the UN study on violence against children in 2006, many of these interventions were already urged and promoted. I think what we have now is a much bigger body of evidence and research which has shown how they can be effective. And they stress a number, it's called Inspire because it's INSPIRE, and each of the letters stands for a set of interventions. But a couple of the things that are really stressed are indeed approaches to parenting and positive parenting practices, the need to strengthen social protection, to support families in their caregiving role beyond knowledge and capacities. And I think the third thing is about changing norms. The N is changing norms and that condone the use of particularly violent approaches to discipline. So I think that's a very good starting point for those who need to see the details. If I may, I'd like to speak about something else which is perhaps at a more abstract level for some in the room, which is, I think the adoption of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda was also extremely important. We have in the 2030 Agenda, the very vision of the agenda is to create a world free from fear and from violence, with no one and with no child left behind. So I think the adoption of that agenda was a very important milestone. And in particular because it contains for the first time an explicit target, 16.2, which calls for the ending of all forms of violence against children. It's never been on the International Development Agenda, surprisingly, before, but now we have it. We also have a specific target, as Caroline mentioned, on early childhood development, 4.2, which, if I read it correctly, is ensuring all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development, care, and pre-primary education. It doesn't address so much, as you said, the purposes of early childhood development, but it's making sure that, regardless of its purposes, all children with no child left behind has access to it. I wanted to raise the Sustainable Development Agenda because next year is going to be a big year of opportunity in relation to the agenda for two reasons. One is the principal review process for the SDGs is the high-level political forum. It's held every year in July in New York at the under the Economic and Social Council, and they review a subset of the goals through a thematic lens. Well, next year, the thematic lens is going to be about inclusive well, let me get it correct, empowering people and ensuring inclusiveness and equality. And amongst the goals which will be reviewed is Goal 16 and Goal 4, which contain these two targets, which I've mentioned. So this is a great opportunity to show the links between addressing violence in early childhood and reaching target 16.2 for an end to all forms of violence. Later in the year, in September, is an even bigger milestone, because at the General Assembly, it'll be the first time the whole of the agenda is reviewed by the General Assembly. So it will be at the level of the heads of state, at the high-level segment at the beginning of the General Assembly. The whole of the agenda will be reviewed, looking at progress, but looking at where challenges still are. And of course, next year, for many of you, it will be a known fact, is the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So finding a way to bring these opportunities together and to have, at the highest level, a reaffirmation of the commitment to end all forms of violence against children, addressing issues in early childhood, is just going to be very, very important. I think the consortium that's being formed now would be a very good platform for influencing those processes. They happen very much at the national level, as you know, through the national reviews, which governments are requested to present at the high-level political forum. So at the national level, there is an opportunity for faith-based organizations to influence the process. And then when we come to the global level, there are mechanisms to do that. Our office is already now beginning the planning for next year and how to influence those processes. So I think we'll take the lessons learned over the next couple of days to incorporate it into that process and make sure it's represented. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, for also lifting up the agenda, because I think sometimes we are caught up in our daily realities and local realities, but it's also good to see how this can also be influencing these global processes. And we have been speaking a lot about the role of governments and how to influence governments. And I think we can start at the local level and then see how it triples up to influencing these global agendas in different fora at the UN and others. So that's a very important point. I'm aware of the time, but I just want to collect a couple of questions and give just 1 minute back to each of the panelists to respond if there are questions in the audience. So 1, Rebecca 2, and Ellie 3, and Frederick 4. So we introduce yourself, your names, and organizations, please.
So I'm going to stand then.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for raising the Sustainable Development Agenda. I just wanted to point out that I see a disconnect often between what's happening at the UN with the Sustainable Development Goals and this agenda and what's happening in the rest of the world. Most people are not aware of it, as we all know here. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because I thought it was fascinating that when the Sustainable Development Agenda was adopted, that religious leaders were asked for the first time, and I think some of you, maybe Vino, you were part of that. The World Bank actually convened a group of religious leaders to address how they could contribute to the development of these goals, and they were genuinely consulted. I think Dr. Vigna, it was also part of that discussion at the World Bank in Washington. And then it was interesting for me to see that once the World Bank started discussing issues with religious leaders, everybody else became very interested in working with religious leaders. So I think we're at a point now where the value of religious communities and religious leaders is appreciated and seen in a way that was never in the years that I spent. And I should say I spent more than 25 years with UNICEF, so I was fascinated to see this paradigm shift, really, and how we're looking at international issues with that dimension. And having said that, years ago, I used to work on developing the situation analysis in certain countries with UNICEF, and having participated in that process, which took a rights approach, a child rights approach, over time, it was always clear that the early childhood development area was very much neglected, and very little to say on this issue. And I wondered if in the last few years it has become more, dynamic and more prevalent. And then the question for me is, can religious leaders, can faith communities do much more at the national level to put pressure on those governments? Because as we work, and Arigato works from a rights-based framework, I'm thinking, how can we get our religious leaders, first of all, more knowledgeable about the Sustainable Development Goals, the fact that there is a 16.2, the fact that there is a 4.2, and how can we get them, in turn, to be advocates at the national level to push for early childhood development programs and to get that on the national agenda? Because I think it's timely, and I'm just wondering if UNICEF and Andrew can answer where we are now with those policies at the national level. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Ellie Pradavant. I have the Women's World Summit Foundation, and one of our programs is prevention of violence against children and youth. My first question is about peace building and the business community. Is there anything that is happening on that level? Why do I ask these questions? Because I had a friend who started a program to eliminate toys to be sold to children, which are guns and all kinds of weapons. And he had a lot of money. He got very far in reaching it until the business community, and I won't name the names, in Geneva, some shops and big ones, opposed his recommendation to outlaw the sale of guns. And it really struck me that there was no response from UNICEF or even any religious community at that time. But then I have a grandson. He's 9 years old. And we talk about peace and peace building a lot with his grandmother. And when I talk to him about it, why are you so attracted to all these toys? And why do you want this for your birthday? And why are you looking at all these programs? And he said, Grandma, peace is boring. Nothing happens. And, I want excitement. I like the excitement. And I talked to him about it. He's an adopted child from Sri Lanka, and my daughter is the mother. So I developed that a little bit with him, and frankly, I didn't get very far. But I have this big question. How come all these powerful organizations, including UNICEF, including this consortium, including so many extraordinary people, groups, I mean, really, I take my hat off. We have no entry into the business community that increases weapons. They sell them, they train them, they become toys, and the boys just go for it. And how do you see the change in moral quality of our life, if that is the case? That is just one incident, but I can go on forever to talk about it. Then I just want to briefly say that we launched the World Day for Prevention of Child Abuse in the year 2000, because I was already always very interested in the rights of the child. And we have a big network where on that one day, the 19th of November, is dedicated to discussing violence against children and what can be done at the grassroots, and make a synergy with the 20th of November, which is the Universal Children's Day. And we get extraordinary replies from around the world, what they set in motion. Very, very interesting. There is a big desire how to build peace, and yet it is not really supported. What can people do? That led us to create the 19 days of activism for prevention of violence against children and youth from the 1st to the 19th of November. And we have 19 themes touching on 19 different topics of what can be done to reduce and ultimately eliminate violence against children. And we got wonderful feedback from our network. And one country I would like to mention here, it is Poland. They started out very humbly to celebrate the 19th November World Day. They have now a national network of over 300 organizations that are their partners and affiliated partners, and they have gone into businesses, hairdressers, shopkeepers. Everybody knows on the 19th of November, I need to address violence against children in my family, in my shop, in my community. And I just am so inspired by them, because I could never have dreamed that it could actually set on fire a whole country. And it is on our website if you want to look at it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for all these comments, and there will be time to get in the next session after the break. We will have a few panelists, and then we'll be having roundtable discussions where we can exchange more ideas and be more, informal in a way in the discussions.
Okay.
Frederick, if you can be very briefly, so I can give to the.
I'll be brief. I'm sure people are wanting a cup of coffee now. Yes, absolutely. I think there are approaches that work totally with very young children to help them solve conflicts. There's a wonderful program called 7 Steps to Knowledge, Strength and Compassion, which I love. But just, a very practical example. If somebody sees that some children are always, if the teacher notices that there's a group of children or individual children who are always being sidelined and nobody wants to sit next to them, it's not hard to really talk with children and get them to step back and basically ask them the question, what do we really want our classroom to be like? What sort of community do we want to create here? And it doesn't take long to get into a conversation where they've solved that themselves, and you see a real transformation in the way that things operate. Interconnectedness. Young kids love that. And then again, you're breaking down barriers. It's like, oh, this is all so exciting, So peace doesn't have to be boring. I think it can be pretty exciting, seeing how it all works. Change, kids really understanding that actually change happens all the time, and actually there's huge freedom within that to choose how I respond if something happens that I don't like, and so lots of possibility, I think. Yes, early childhood development has been very, very neglected. It's been a pretty big shift in the last few years. We've seen massive increases in enrollments in early childhood programs. It's still shocking that, you know, more than half the kids in low and middle income countries too don't have access still. But from where it was, we are at least going in the right direction. I think it's most worrying in some sub-Saharan African countries, not surprisingly, where still in many there's less than 10% actually in programs. But, and we've done a lot of analysis of this, one of the big things is actually the huge disparity. So it's within countries. So the wealthiest quintile are doing absolutely fine. And if you just look at the overall figure for country enrollments, you think, oh, this looks pretty good. But then when you look at what's happening to the poorest sector, it's really quite shocking. There's a load of countries where actually their access is decreasing. So yes, there is progress, but we really need to look at the equity issues within different countries.
Thank you, Rebecca, for the question. The role of religious communities, faith-based organizations and religious leaders in the agenda is deeply recognized. In fact, in the outcome document, the world that we want, the role is explicitly mentioned, and it's because of the engagement there was in the lead up to the adoption of the agenda. And we might recall that the General Assembly that adopted the agenda was opened by Pope Francis, who made a very powerful statement on the need to embrace the agenda and to implement the actions needed to reach the targets. So I don't think there's any doubt that they can be influential. These processes which happen are somewhat slow. It's true we're coming to the end of the first phase. Next year will mark the end of the first phase of the 2030 agenda, the first 4 years. And I think I wouldn't quite agree with you that it hasn't filtered down. I do attend quite a number of meetings and so on where there is a recognition that the agenda is there. Perhaps the interconnectedness of the agenda isn't appreciated. Very often people will look at their particular area of interest and focus very much on that and not perhaps appreciate the extent to which we must emphasize that it's an integrated agenda. People complain sometimes, 169 targets, it's all very complicated and so on, but that's because the world is complicated. And we can't just separate out small issues and try to address them separately, which is why I made the point that when the review happens next year, where we have actually 3 goals which will be key being reviewed next year, which are key to prevention of violence against children. As I mentioned, Goal 4, Goal 16, but also Goal 8, which has Target 8.7 to end all forms of child labour. So we have to find ways in which the efforts to address all of these targets are linked. The rationale that I presented earlier, if I can make a plug for this pamphlet, I think there's enough for everybody. This really outlines the position of the SRSG and why violence prevention of all kinds, but particularly violence against children, really does need to begin in early childhood. And she further expands on that. I'm sure many of you are aware of Early Childhood Matters. This is the house journal of the Bernard Van Leer Foundation. And the SRSG has, again, a very good piece in this issue, a leadership piece on making those connections. Thank you.
Very quickly, I think I'm a medical doctor, and we have a very good record in Sri Lanka of vaccination, universal coverage. But we have to now think of social vaccination, not biological vaccination. Despite the availability of very attractive toys, how can I make my child not attractive to that by empowering him? So can we look at a situation where, in fact, we are doing that now for nutrition. There are many wrong nutritional messages that are being given, marketing of very unhealthy products by commercial companies. So we tried to get them to be more ethical in advertising. We are failing because this industry is so powerful that they won't listen, although we continue our struggle to influence the private sector not to do this. But what we are doing is trying to get the children to even ridicule those advertisements by, so it's difficult. But they then find it very, very fascinating also, because once you really train them on how to evaluate a message at that kind of, these are of course little bit older children, not very young children, it's quite successful. So I think we can really empower children to have better choices, and then withstand, despite those negative elements being there in the environment, that they will not be negatively influenced by them. So I think we need to look at tools that will empower. And nonviolent communication, as you mentioned, I think is quite applicable to children as well. And there are many things that we are doing also at our local level, particularly in areas where we have had a war, trying to get different children from different communities to come together and communicate. So I think we have to look at how to empower, how to really vaccinate our children socially.
I'm also a big fan of nonviolent communication. It can do so many good things. I'm wondering, and I don't know, and I would love to know to what young age actually that can be practiced. I know that Marshall Rosenberg used puppets and had children talk with it. I have seen the giraffe and the wolf in Palestine schools, and I was really, really surprised and impressed. But I also try to practice nonviolent communication. It's actually not easy. It's an easy concept, very difficult to translate. And I think unless you practice it all your life and the schools are promoting, I don't think it's easily being learned in a weekend workshop. But it's a great topic. I think we should actually explore that. Why don't we just tell governments to do more ECD? It's even those governments who love and endorse it, it's a big problem. I mean, primary education is not functioning well because it's badly funded. Teachers are badly funded. Now we want to go into second decade learning, and now you're telling us we should go in ECD also. It's a huge problem. And but there are also interesting approaches. Like in Egypt right now, we are supporting a program for home-based nurseries where the government says we cannot build an ECD system, but we are giving salaries for women who want to do their home-based nursery businesses. You know, there are also creative ways around it, but it's also a financial issue. But in terms of communicating, Andrew, what you said earlier, one thing which we're also recognizing, we are all in love with neurosciences. Actually, people who are illiterate are also interested. They want to know how their child's brain can become a beautiful garden. We have not yet learned to communicate these concepts to the non-scientific, non-academically trained community. Peace building and business. I remember I was in 2012, I was giving a talk about education for peace building in DRC, and I did really a good talk, I thought, and then somebody said out, look, as long as you don't stop weapons trade, why are you even talking about ECD for peace, education for peace building? I felt so stupid. But on the other hand, we really cannot, as UNICEF now, go against weapons trade. I mean, this has to go through other areas. The same thing with companies who sell weapons toys. Don't know whether UNICEF thinks that it can make a big change by just working on this area. What your son said is fantastic feedback, really good feedback. Wow, yeah. Peace is boring and war is fun. I mean, he probably is right. I mean, who doesn't watch Die Hard, like to watch Die Hard with Bruce Willis? So we actually have to come up with, something which makes working for peace as exciting as working for war. So we need to do some brainstorming there. But there are private organizations like H&M Foundation, for example, is giving money for UNICEF to fund, to develop a measurement framework to measure the impact of early childhood development programs on social cohesion. We're working with other foundations who are interested in this topic. As a matter of fact, young children and peace, those are cool topics. People like it. People want to identify with it. DHL is all over the world, brings in local migrant youth and gives them internships of a year or longer, picking them up from SOS Children villages and others. I think the business community can do so much good. We need to work in this area. That was it.
Thank you very much. I don't need to conclude because this continues and we really need to go for the break so you can interact and have more questions. So please enjoy the break and we are back here in 20 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, the panelists. Thank you very much.